Black veteran vanished in 1970. 35 years later, Ranger finds this under a fake rock. Before we dive into this powerful story of truth, justice, and redemption, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. This is a tale that will touch your heart and remind you that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign soil, but right here at home. Enjoy the story. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of David Hayes' modest Nashville apartment as he shuffled toward the kitchen, his 42-year-old frame moving with the weariness of a man carrying invisible burdens. The coffee maker gurgled to life, its familiar sound providing the only comfort in his solitary routine. David reached for the remote, hoping the morning news would distract him from another sleepless night. Instead, the television screen filled with images that made his chest tighten. A documentary about Vietnam veterans, their haunted faces staring back at him through the static. Many veterans returned home to a country that didn't understand their sacrifice. The narrator's voice echoed through the small apartment. Some never truly came home at all. His hand trembled as he quickly changed the channel, but it was too late. The memories came flooding back like they always did: his father's empty chair at the dinner table, his mother's tear-stained face, the endless questions that never had answers. Samuel Hayes had vanished 35 years ago without a trace, leaving behind only whispered theories about PTSD and possible suicide. David was just 7 years old when his hero simply disappeared, taking with him any faith David might have had in the American system that was supposed to protect its own. The shrill ring of his phone cut through his thoughts like a knife. "Mr. Hayes? This is Detective Lisa Rodriguez with the Tennessee State Police. I'm calling about your father, Samuel Hayes." David's coffee cup slipped from his hand, shattering against the kitchen floor. After 3.5 decades of silence, someone was finally calling about his father. "We need you to come to Great Smoky Mountains National Park, sir. A park ranger found something that belongs to your family." The 2-hour drive to Great Smoky Mountains felt like a journey through time. David's knuckles were white against the steering wheel as he navigated the winding mountain roads, his mind racing with possibilities he'd buried long ago. Detective Rodriguez met him at the ranger station, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with graying temples and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded David of his elementary school principal. Beside her stood Jake Thompson, a weathered park ranger whose calloused hands spoke of decades spent in these ancient mountains. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for coming," Detective Rodriguez said, her voice carrying that practiced tone of compassion mixed with professional distance. "Jake here made quite a discovery yesterday." The ranger shifted uncomfortably, his eyes avoiding David's. "I was cataloging new trail markers when I noticed something that didn't belong. What looked like a natural rock formation was actually, well, it was fake." They walked deeper into the forest, boots crunching on fallen leaves. The air grew thicker, more oppressive, as if the mountains themselves were holding secrets. Jake stopped beside what appeared to be an ordinary boulder nestled between 2 oak trees. "Underneath this," Jake said, lifting the surprisingly light artificial rock, "we found this." David's breath caught in his throat. There, partially buried in the dark earth, sat a military-issued metal box, its olive-green paint faded but still recognizable. Stenciled across the top in white letters was a name that made his knees weak. S. Hayes, U.S. Army. Detective Rodriguez snapped on latex gloves before carefully opening the container. Inside, nestled in what remained of an old towel, were his father's military medals, a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, ribbons David had only seen in faded photographs. But it was the leather-bound journal beneath them that made his hands shake. "The medals are too clean," Detective Rodriguez observed, her trained eye catching details David's emotional state had missed. "They've been cleaned recently, probably right before burial. This wasn't here for 35 years. David opened the journal with trembling fingers. His father's handwriting, cramped but familiar, filled the yellowed pages. Most entries were illegible, damaged by time and moisture, but one passage near the middle made his blood run cold. "Morrison and Buchanan. Can't let this slide. The veterans' money." Those names hit David like a physical blow. Morrison and Buchanan, pillars of his hometown community, respected businessmen whose construction company had built half the civic buildings in the county. What had his father discovered about them? And why was someone just now burying these metals? David's hands were still shaking as he unlocked the storage unit across town that held his father's remaining possessions. He hadn't been here in 5 years, but the musty smell of old cardboard and forgotten memories hit him like a wave. Boxes labeled in his mother's careful handwriting lined the metal shelves. Samuel's Army papers, letters, photos 1968 to 1970. David pulled down the letterbox first, his heart pounding as he sifted through correspondence that might finally give context to that cryptic journal entry. The first few letters were routine, thank you notes from fellow veterans, bills, mundane family correspondence. But then David found what he was looking for. A series of letters from 1970, written in his father's increasingly frustrated tone. Dear Margaret, one letter began, addressed to his mother. The benefits office is giving me the runaround again. Bob Morrison keeps saying the paperwork is lost, but I saw my file on Buchanan's desk yesterday when I delivered those blueprints. Something isn't right about how they're handling the disability claims. David's pulse quickened. His father had worked part-time for Morrison and Buchanan Construction while waiting for his military benefits to be processed. He'd had access to their offices, their files. Another letter, this one never sent, revealed more. I found the discrepancies in the ledgers today. Federal money earmarked for disabled veterans is being diverted. They're stealing from men who gave everything for this country. I can't stay silent. The final piece of the puzzle came in a manila envelope stuffed with newspaper clippings. Headlines from 1970 announced Morrison and Buchanan Construction winning major government contracts. A new veterans hospital, military housing projects, federal building renovations. All funded with taxpayer money that should have been helping wounded soldiers. David sat back on his heels, the evidence scattered around him like pieces of a deadly puzzle. His father hadn't abandoned his family. He hadn't committed suicide in some remote forest, overcome by war trauma. Samuel Hayes had discovered a conspiracy to steal from veterans, and it had gotten him killed. The same Morrison and Buchanan Construction that still dominated his hometown. The same Bob Morrison and Charles Buchanan who were now elderly pillars of the community, their reputations built on stolen valor and blood money. David reached for his phone, his decision made. It was time to go home and face the men who had stolen his father and his childhood. The town hadn't changed much in the decade since David's last visit. Main Street still bore the architectural fingerprints of Morrison and Buchanan Construction, the courthouse, the library, even the Veterans Memorial Park. Everywhere he looked, he saw monuments to the men who had destroyed his family. The VFW Hall sat at the corner of Elm and 3rd, its faded American flag hanging limp in the humid Tennessee air. David pushed through the heavy wooden doors, breathing in the familiar smell of cigarettes and old coffee that permeated every veteran's gathering place in America. Eddie Mitchell, the current post commander, looked up from behind the bar with eyes that had seen too much. At 70, he moved with the careful precision of a man whose body had been broken and reassembled more times than he cared to count. David Hayes, Eddie said, recognition dawning slowly. Been a long time, son. Sorry about what happened to your daddy. That's actually why I'm here, Mr. Mitchell. I've been learning some things about the circumstances of his disappearance. Eddie's expression shifted, a wariness creeping into his weathered features. Your daddy was a good man, David. Sometimes good men get overwhelmed by demons they can't fight. What if those demons had names? Like Morrison and Buchanan? The coffee cup in Eddie's hand rattled against its saucer. That's dangerous talk, son. Those men have done a lot for this community. With stolen money? Eddie stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the worn linoleum. You need to talk to Martha Washington. She worked at the benefits office back then. Lives over on Peach Street now, in the blue house with the rose garden. The dismissal was clear, but David had gotten what he came for, confirmation that others remembered, and a name. Martha Washington answered her door with the cautious smile of a woman who had learned to read danger in men's faces. At 78, she remained sharp-eyed and elegant, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the afternoon heat. "You're Samuel Hayes' boy," she said before David could introduce himself. "You have his eyes." Mrs. Washington, Eddie Mitchell, said, "You might remember my father from the benefits office." Her expression grew grave. "Come in, child. It's time someone heard the truth." Martha's living room was a shrine to family photographs and church programs, but her voice carried the steel of a woman who had survived decades of keeping dangerous secrets. "I saw them changing the paperwork," she whispered, glancing toward the windows as if Morrison and Buchanan might be listening. "Disability claims getting lost, federal funds being redirected to their construction projects. Your daddy started asking questions, and I was too scared to help him." The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the town, its weathered headstones telling the story of generations who had called this place home. David found his mother's grave easily. He'd memorized the path during those terrible months after her funeral 10 years ago. But he wasn't alone among the monuments. A small figure huddled beside a nearby grave, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. David approached carefully, recognizing the pain of a child trying to grieve in solitude. "Hey there," David said softly. "You okay, son?" The boy looked up with fever-bright eyes and a face flushed with illness. He couldn't have been more than 12, with dark hair and features that reminded David of Detective Rodriguez. "I'm Tommy," the boy whispered, his voice hoarse. "Tommy Rodriguez. This is my grandpa's grave. He was in Vietnam too, like your daddy probably was." David knelt beside the child, feeling an unexpected kinship. "How did you know about my father?" "Tia Lisa told me. She's my aunt, the detective lady. She said you were coming to visit your mama." Tommy wiped his nose with a torn sleeve. "I don't want to go back to the Hendersons. They don't like me much." Something cold settled in David's stomach. "The Hendersons are your foster parents?" Tommy nodded miserably. "They get money for keeping me, but they say I eat too much and cost too much when I get sick." He touched his forehead, wincing. "I feel real bad today, but Mrs. Henderson said I was faking it to get attention." David pressed his hand to Tommy's forehead and felt the unmistakable heat of serious fever. This child needed medical attention, not neglect from people who saw him as a burden rather than a blessing. "Tommy, I'm going to take you to see a doctor, okay? Then we'll call your aunt." "But first," Tommy said, gripping David's arm with surprising strength, "can you take me to get communion from the church? My abuela used to give it to me when I was sick. She said it would make Jesus watch over me." David felt his throat tighten. He hadn't set foot in a church since his father's disappearance, his faith shattered by decades of unanswered prayers. But looking at this vulnerable child, burning with fever and abandoned by the adults meant to protect him, David felt something shift inside his chest. "Of course, son. We'll get you that communion." As they walked toward his truck, Tommy's small hand in his, David realized that sometimes angels come disguised as broken children who need saving as much as they need to save others. The First Baptist Church of Cedar Ridge stood like a fortress of red brick and white columns, its steeple reaching toward heaven while secrets festered in its foundation. David helped Tommy up the worn stone steps, the boy's fever making him unsteady on his feet. Pastor Jerome Williams met them at the heavy oak doors, his kind face creased with concern. "Brother Hayes, it's been many years. And who is this young man?" "This is Tommy Rodriguez. He's asking for communion. His grandmother used to give it to him when he was ill." Pastor Williams' expression softened as he looked at the feverish child. "Of course. Come to the sanctuary while I prepare the elements." As the pastor disappeared into the vestry, David found himself alone in the church library adjacent to the sanctuary. Dusty theological texts and administrative manuals lined the shelves, but it was a slim volume on community fund management that caught his attention when it tumbled to the floor. David bent to retrieve it, and several yellowed papers scattered across the carpet. His blood turned to ice as he recognized the letterhead, Morrison and Buchanan Construction, dated December 1970. The first document was a memorandum detailing the redirection of federal Veterans Assistance funds into community development projects that would later become the church's new fellowship hall and Morrison's personal lake house. But it was the second paper that made David's hands shake with rage. A handwritten note in Bob Morrison's distinctive scrawl. The Hayes problem needs permanent resolution. Too many questions, too much risk. Jerome confirms the church will stay quiet if we complete the sanctuary renovation as promised. David photographed everything with trembling fingers, his phone's camera capturing evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of his childhood faith. Even the church, the institution that was supposed to provide sanctuary and truth, had been bought with blood money. Pastor Williams returned carrying a small silver chalice and communion wafer, his face pale when he saw David crouched among the scattered papers. Brother Hayes, those are old administrative documents. Nothing of importance. Nothing of importance? David stood slowly, his voice dangerously quiet. These papers prove that Morrison and Buchanan bought your silence with stolen money. You knew they killed my father, and you said nothing. Pastor Williams aged 10 years in 10 seconds. You don't understand the pressure we were under. The church was failing, the roof was caving in. When they offered to fund the renovations, you sold your soul, David finished. And my father paid the price. Tommy tugged at David's sleeve, his young voice cutting through the adult tension. Mr. David, can I still get my communion? My head really hurts. David knelt beside the boy, forcing his rage into a compartment where it couldn't hurt this innocent child. Of course, Tommy. Jesus isn't responsible for what grown-ups do wrong. David spent the next 3 days conducting careful surveillance, parking his rental car across from the Morrison and Buchanan construction office building. The structure itself was a monument to their success, 3 stories of brick and glass that dominated the corner of Main and Commerce, built with money that should have gone to disabled veterans. Bob Morrison, now 82 but still sharp-eyed and mobile, arrived each morning at precisely 9 o'clock. Charles Buchanan appeared more frail, requiring a walking cane and moving with the careful shuffle of advanced age. But both men maintained their routine, meeting daily in the corner office on the 2nd floor. David had installed a recording app on his phone, determined to capture evidence of their ongoing conspiracy. On the 3rd day, his patience was rewarded. Pretending to be a potential client interested in home renovation, David entered the reception area and asked to speak with the senior partners about a construction project. The secretary, a nervous woman in her 50s, led him to a waiting area just outside Morrison's office. Through the partially open door, David could hear Morrison's voice, agitated and harsh. That Hayes boy has been asking questions all over town. Martha Washington clammed up after he visited her. And Jerome called me in a panic about some papers he found. Buchanan's voice was weaker but equally concerned, just like his father, too damn curious for his own good. We handled Samuel when he wouldn't take the money and stay quiet, Morrison continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that David had to strain to hear. Maybe it's time to handle his son the same way. David's blood turned to ice. His phone was recording everything, but he needed to stay calm, to not react in a way that would alert them to his presence. The boy's been to the cemetery, the church, asking about the old days, Buchanan wheezed. Eddie Mitchell said he knows about the ledgers. Then we need to move fast, Morrison replied. I still have contacts in the sheriff's department. An accident in those mountain roads wouldn't surprise anyone. David forced himself to breathe normally as the secretary returned. I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes, but the partners are in conference and won't be available today. Perhaps you could come back next week. Of course, David managed, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. I'll call to schedule an appointment. Outside, David's hands shook as he forwarded the recording to Detective Rodriguez with a text message. They're planning to kill me, just like they killed my father. The confession is on this recording. His phone buzzed immediately with Rodriguez's response. Stay in public places. I'm sending backup. We're moving tonight. David looked back at the Morrison and Buchanan building, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun like eyes watching his every move. 35 years later, the same men were planning the same solution to the same problem. But this time, they wouldn't get away with murder. David's phone rang at 6:47 p.m. as he sat in a diner on the far side of town. forcing himself to eat while watching the parking lot for any sign of Morrison's silver Cadillac. "Hayes, this is Rodriguez." Morrison just left his office in a hurry, driving toward the mountains. "I'm 20 minutes behind him with backup, but I need you to stay put." "Detective, I can't just sit here while he destroys evidence or—" "David, listen to me. These men have killed before. Stay in that diner until I give you the all-clear." But David was already moving toward his truck. 35 years of questions weren't going to be answered by playing it safe. "I'm going to follow him. I'll stay back, but I need to see this through." The winding mountain road toward Great Smoky Mountains was treacherous in daylight, deadly after dark. David kept his headlights off, following Morrison's taillights at a distance that made him nervous. The old man was driving with surprising urgency for someone his age. Morrison's Cadillac turned off the main road onto a barely visible Forest Service trail, the same area where the fake rock had been discovered. David parked behind a stand of pine trees and continued on foot, his phone's GPS tracking his location for Rodriguez. Through the darkness, David could see Morrison's flashlight beam dancing among the trees. The old man was carrying a shovel and what looked like a canvas bag, moving with the desperate energy of someone running out of time. David crept closer, using his phone to record video while texting his location to Detective Rodriguez. Morrison was digging frantically near a cluster of oak trees, muttering to himself as dirt flew from his shovel. "Should have done this years ago," Morrison panted between shovelfuls. "Should have moved the body when they found that damn box." David's heart stopped. The body. His father's body was here, somewhere in this dark forest where Morrison was now trying to relocate the evidence of his crime. A branch snapped under David's foot, the sound echoing through the quiet woods like a gunshot. Morrison's flashlight beam swung toward him, and David found himself staring into the wild eyes of a cornered killer. "David Hayes," Morrison said, his voice carrying a mixture of resignation and rage. "Just like your daddy. Can't leave well enough alone." Morrison dropped the shovel and reached into his jacket, pulling out a revolver that gleamed in the flashlight beam. 35 years I've been waiting for this conversation." David raised his hands, his phone still recording. "The police know where I am, Morrison. Detective Rodriguez is on her way." "Then we better make this quick," Morrison said, raising the gun. "Just like we made it quick for your father." In the distance, David could hear the faint sound of sirens winding through the mountain roads. But they seemed impossibly far away, and Morrison's finger was already tightening on the trigger. The standoff stretched across the dark forest like a taut wire ready to snap. Morrison's gun hand trembled slightly. Whether from age or adrenaline, David couldn't tell. The sirens were getting closer, but not close enough. "You know what your father's problem was?" Morrison said, his voice carrying the bitter tone of a man confessing to ghosts. "He thought being a hero in Vietnam made him a hero everywhere. Thought he could waltz into our business and play white knight." David kept his phone recording, hoping Rodriguez could track the audio if this went wrong. He was trying to help veterans who'd been cheated, men who sacrificed everything for this country. Sacrificed? Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the trees. "We all sacrificed, boy. I built this town when there was nothing here but dirt roads and broken dreams. Those federal contracts kept families fed, kept the economy alive. With money stolen from disabled veterans. Redirected," Morrison corrected. "The veterans were going to die anyway. PTSD, suicide, drug overdoses. At least our way, the money did some good for living people." The casual cruelty of it hit David like a physical blow. This man saw wounded veterans as acceptable losses, their suffering as collateral damage in his empire building. Morrison stepped closer, the gun now pointing directly at David's chest. "Your daddy wouldn't listen to reason. We offered him $5,000 to keep quiet, more money than he'd see in 2 years. But no, Samuel Hayes had to be the righteous veteran, couldn't be bought. So you killed him." "Buchanan killed him," Morrison said, as if the distinction mattered. "December 15th, 1970. We told Samuel we wanted to negotiate, asked him to meet us at the old logging road. When he wouldn't take the money, wouldn't promise to stay quiet. Charles panicked, wrapped his hands around Samuel's throat and squeezed until he stopped fighting. David's vision blurred with rage and grief. The image of his father, alone and betrayed in these same woods, struggling against his killer while his 7-year-old son waited at home for a bedtime story that would never come. "We buried him deep," Morrison continued, his confession pouring out like poison. "Made sure nobody would ever find the body. Then we spread stories about his drinking, his nightmares, how he'd been talking about ending it all. People believed what they wanted to believe. The sirens were close now, maybe a quarter-mile away. Morrison heard them too, his eyes darting toward the access road where headlights were beginning to flicker through the trees. "Should have killed you when you were a kid," Morrison said, raising the gun toward David's head. "Would have saved us both a lot of trouble. Drop the weapon." Detective Rodriguez's voice boomed through the forest, amplified by a megaphone. "Morrison, you're surrounded." Morrison's finger tightened on the trigger, but in that instant of hesitation, David dove sideways behind a fallen log. The gunshot shattered the night air, splintering bark inches from his head. Flashlight beams converged on Morrison from 3 directions as Rodriguez and her officers moved through the trees like avenging angels. Morrison's gun clattered to the forest floor as 3 officers tackled him simultaneously, their combined weight driving the elderly man into the dirt he'd been digging. David emerged from behind the fallen log, his legs shaking with adrenaline as Detective Rodriguez secured the weapon. "Are you hurt?" Rodriguez asked, checking David for injuries while keeping one eye on her team as they cuffed Morrison. "I'm okay, but Detective," he confessed, "everything's on my phone. He admitted to killing my father, told me exactly how it happened." Morrison struggled against the handcuffs, his voice cracking with desperation. "You can't prove anything. It's his word against mine, and I'm a respected member of this community." Rodriguez looked at the shovel, the disturbed earth, the canvas bag Morrison had dropped. "We'll see about that, Mr. Morrison. You have the right to remain silent." But Morrison wasn't silent. During the 40-minute drive down the mountain to the county jail, he talked continuously, as if 35 years of guilt had finally burst through a dam. Detective Rodriguez's dashboard camera captured every word. At the station, under the harsh fluorescent lights of interview room B, Morrison's facade completely crumbled. Faced with David's recording, the physical evidence from the forest, and the weight of decades of deception, he signed a full confession at 2:17 a.m. "Charles and I never meant for it to go that far," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were making good money, legitimate money, but the federal contracts were too tempting. Disabled veterans were dying anyway. Suicide rates were through the roof. We figured their benefit money could do more good building up the community." David sat behind the one-way glass, watching the man who had destroyed his childhood reveal the pathetic logic that had justified murder. Samuel Hayes was supposed to be grateful for the part-time work, but he started asking questions about discrepancies in the benefit applications. "We tried to buy his silence, offered him enough money to move his family somewhere nice." Morrison's hands shook as he signed each page of his statement. When he threatened to contact federal investigators, Charles panicked. Samuel was bigger, stronger, but Charles got behind him and Morrison made a choking gesture. It was over in less than 2 minutes. The confession continued with mechanical precision. How they'd buried Samuel's body in an unmarked grave, spread rumors about his mental state, even planted evidence to support the suicide theory. The fake rock containing Samuel's medals had been Morrison's insurance policy. If the body was ever discovered, they could claim Samuel had hidden his medals before taking his own life. The medals were supposed to make it look like he was planning suicide, Morrison explained. "We cleaned them up, wrote a fake note, buried them separately. We figured if anyone found the grave, they'd also find the suicide cache and stop looking for other explanations." At 4:30 a.m., Morrison's lawyer arrived and immediately advised his client to stop talking. But the damage was done. 35 years of questions had been answered in one night of desperate confessions. David walked out of the police station as dawn broke over the Tennessee mountains, carrying the truth his father had died trying to reveal. 3 days after Morrison's confession, the forensic team arrived at the coordinates he'd provided under interrogation. David stood at the edge of the crime scene tape, watching professionals excavate the truth from soil that had kept it secret for 35 years. Dr. Sarah Chen, the state forensic anthropologist, worked with archaeological precision. Each layer of earth was photographed, cataloged, and carefully removed. The grave was shallow. Morrison and Buchanan had been amateurs at murder, digging only deep enough to hide their crime from casual discovery. "We found textile fragments," Dr. Chen called out, her voice carrying across the morning air, consistent with 1970s workwear, denim and cotton blend. David's throat tightened. His father's work clothes, the same outfit Samuel had worn to his part-time job at Morrison and Buchanan Construction on that December day when he'd never come home. Detective Rodriguez stood beside David, her presence both professional and oddly comforting. "You don't have to watch this part." "Yes, I do," David replied quietly. "I've been waiting 35 years to know for certain." The bones emerged piece by piece, each fragment a testament to violence and injustice. Dr. Chen worked with reverent care, treating Samuel Hayes' remains with the dignity he'd been denied in death. "Definitive identification through dental records," Dr. Chen announced hours later. "The fracture pattern on the hyoid bone is consistent with manual strangulation. This was homicide, not suicide." The words should have brought satisfaction, but David felt only profound sadness. His father, the man who'd taught him to ride a bicycle, who'd read him bedtime stories, who'd served his country with honor, had been murdered and buried like garbage by men who saw him as an inconvenience. Rodriguez's phone buzzed with updates from the Financial Crimes Unit. The forensic accountants have been through Morrison and Buchanan's old records. Conservative estimate is they diverted over $500,000 in federal veteran assistance funds between 1968 and 1975. $500,000 that could have provided medical care, disability benefits, and housing assistance to men who'd sacrificed their health for America. Instead, it had built vacation homes, funded political campaigns, and lined the pockets of two men who saw veterans as expendable. "What about Buchanan?" David asked. "Advanced dementia. His family placed him in memory care 2 years ago. The doctors say he doesn't recognize his own children anymore, let alone remember crimes from decades past. Justice would be incomplete. One killer would face trial, while the other lived in the mercy of forgetting that his victim's family had been denied for 35 years. As the forensic team carefully transported Samuel's remains to the medical examiner's office, David made a silent promise to his father. Samuel Hayes would finally receive the military burial he'd earned, and his death would expose a conspiracy that had robbed hundreds of veteran families. Morrison might escape earthly justice through age and infirmity, but the truth would shine light into every corner of their decades-old corruption. The mountains had finally given up their secret, and Samuel Hayes was coming home. The hospital's pediatric ward smelled of antiseptic and hope, a stark contrast to the dark forests where David had spent the last week uncovering buried truths. Tommy Rodriguez sat propped up in bed, his fever finally broken, coloring in a book about dinosaurs while his Aunt Carmen read quietly in the bedside chair. "Mr. David." Tommy's face lit up when he saw David approaching with a small white cloth in his hands. "You came back, and you brought my communion." Carmen Rodriguez looked up from her magazine, her expression softening with gratitude. "Detective Rodriguez told me what you did for Tommy. Thank you for not letting him suffer alone." David pulled a chair close to Tommy's bed, unwrapping the communion wafer Pastor Williams had blessed that morning. Despite everything that had happened at the church, David had returned to complete his promise to this child. "Tommy, your grandmother's communion was about remembering that you're loved and protected, even when the world feels scary. Is that something you'd like to remember today?" The boy nodded solemnly, his small hands folded in his lap with surprising reverence. David broke the wafer into 2 pieces, offering one to Tommy while keeping the other. "This represents hope," David said, watching Tommy's eyes shine with trust. "It means that even when bad things happen, there are people who care about you and want to keep you safe." As Tommy ate his piece of the communion wafer, David felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the bitter knot that had lived there for 35 years. Taking care of this vulnerable child was healing wounds David hadn't even known were still bleeding. "Mr. David," Tommy said quietly, "Tia Carmen says I get to live with her now. The Hendersons don't want me back, and she says that's probably for the best." Carmen nodded, reaching over to squeeze her nephew's hand. "Detective Rodriguez and I talked it over. Tommy needs family who'll love him properly, not people who see him as a burden." David felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Tommy, would you like me to visit you sometimes? Maybe help you with homework or take you fishing?" "Really? You'd want to do that? I'd be honored to do that." Looking at Tommy's bright smile, David realized that his father's death had taught him something valuable about protecting innocent people. Samuel Hayes had died trying to defend veterans who couldn't defend themselves. Now David had a chance to carry on that legacy by looking after a child who needed guidance and protection. As he prepared to leave, David made a decision that would have made his father proud. The lawsuit he was planning against Morrison's estate wouldn't just be about justice. It would fund a scholarship program for children like Tommy, kids who'd been failed by the system but deserved better chances. "I'll see you this weekend," David promised, ruffling Tommy's hair. "Maybe we can work on that math homework together." Outside the hospital room, David felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: purpose beyond his own pain. The courthouse in downtown Nashville buzzed with activity as Bob Morrison, now 82 and using a wheelchair, was wheeled into the defendant's dock. The man who had once commanded construction crews and corrupted public officials now looked frail and diminished, his expensive suit hanging loose on his shrunken frame. David sat in the gallery's first row, flanked by Detective Rodriguez and Martha Washington, who had finally found the courage to testify about what she'd witnessed 5 decades ago. Behind them, over 30 family members of affected veterans filled the benches. Widows, children, and grandchildren of men who had died without receiving the benefits they'd earned. Judge Patricia Hendricks, herself a Vietnam veteran, presided with barely concealed anger as the prosecution presented evidence of the conspiracy. Morrison's confession played through the courtroom speakers, his voice mechanically detailing how he and Buchanan had systematically stolen from disabled veterans. The defendants diverted $547,000 in federal funds between 1968 and 1975, Assistant District Attorney Michael Torres announced. Money that should have provided medical care, disability payments, and housing assistance to men who sacrificed their health serving this nation. Martha Washington's testimony was devastating. Speaking in a clear, steady voice despite her 78 years, she described watching Morrison alter disability applications, seeing federal checks deposited into construction company accounts, and living with decades of guilt for her silence. "I was a single mother with 3 children," Martha said, tears streaming down her face. "Bob Morrison made it clear that if I talked, I'd lose my job and never work in this town again. I chose my family's survival over justice, and I've regretted it every day since." The prosecution's final witness was David himself. Taking the stand, he spoke directly to Morrison as he described 35 years of wondering why his father had abandoned his family. "You didn't just kill Samuel Hayes," David said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "You killed a 7-year-old boy's faith in justice in America, in the idea that good people are protected by the system they serve." Morrison's defense attorney, a sharp-suited lawyer from Memphis, tried to argue that his client's advanced age and health problems warranted leniency. But Judge Hendricks cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Mr. Morrison lived free for 35 years while Samuel Hayes rotted in an unmarked grave," she said, her voice sharp with contempt. "He built a fortune on stolen veteran benefits while disabled soldiers struggled to survive. Age doesn't erase the magnitude of these crimes." The verdict came after only 2 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts of murder, conspiracy, and federal fraud. Judge Hendricks sentenced Morrison to life in prison without possibility of parole, plus an additional 25 years for the federal charges. As the bailiffs wheeled Morrison away, he looked directly at David for the first time during the trial. In those rheumy eyes, David saw not remorse, but resentment, the bitter fury of a man who couldn't understand why his victims refused to stay buried. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded David with questions, but he had only one statement. This verdict doesn't bring back my father or undo 35 years of injustice, but it proves that truth has its own power, and eventually, it will find its way to light. The morning of Samuel Hayes' memorial service dawned clear and cold, with autumn leaves carpeting the cemetery in shades of gold and red. David stood before the new military headstone, its pristine white marble a stark contrast to the weathered markers surrounding it. Samuel Hayes. The inscription read, Sergeant, U.S. Army, Vietnam 1968 to 1969, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, beloved father and patriot. Veterans from 3 different wars had gathered to honor a man they'd never met but whose sacrifice they understood intimately. Eddie Mitchell, despite his earlier reluctance to get involved, now served as color guard, holding the American flag with hands that trembled from both age and emotion. Samuel Hayes died defending his fellow veterans, Pastor Williams said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. He chose integrity over safety, truth over comfort. Today we honor not just a soldier, but a man who never stopped fighting for what was right. Martha Washington sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Beside her, Tommy Rodriguez held David's hand. His young face solemn with the weight of ceremony, he was only beginning to understand. The 21-gun salute echoed across the hills, followed by the haunting notes of taps, played by a high school student whose grandfather had served with Samuel in Vietnam. As the flag was folded with military precision and presented to David, he felt his father's presence for the first time since childhood. On behalf of a grateful nation, the honor guard said, "We present this flag to you in recognition of your father's faithful and honorable service." David accepted the flag with hands that no longer shook with anger, only with grief and gratitude. Behind him, Detective Rodriguez wiped away tears while her nephew Tommy watched with wide eyes, learning what it meant to honor sacrifice. After the service, as the crowd dispersed among the headstones, David found himself alone with Pastor Williams. The minister approached hesitantly, his face etched with shame and sorrow. "David, I know my apologies can't undo the harm I caused by staying silent, but I want you to know that our church board voted unanimously to establish the Samuel Hayes Memorial Fund for veteran families in need." David studied the man who had kept his father's murder secret for 35 years. Williams looked older, more fragile, as if truth-telling had aged him in ways that secret-keeping never had. "Pastor, my father believed in redemption. He would have said that admitting your mistakes is the first step toward making them right." As the sun set over the Tennessee hills, David stood once more before his father's grave. But this time he wasn't alone. Tommy had returned with a small bouquet of wildflowers, which he placed carefully beside the headstone. "Mr. David," Tommy said quietly, "do you think your daddy knows we found him?" David looked down at the boy who had become like a son to him, then up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. "Yes, Tommy, I think he knows. And I think he's proud that we didn't give up looking for the truth." 6 months later, David stood in the reception hall of the newly established Samuel Hayes Center for Veteran Families, watching Tommy Rodriguez help his tutor solve math problems at a corner table. The boy had grown 3 inches and gained 15 pounds since moving in with his Aunt Carmen, thriving under the care of people who saw him as a blessing rather than a burden. "Mr. Hayes, the scholarship applications are ready for your review," said Jennifer Walsh, the center's director and a former military social worker. "We have 43 applicants for the first 10 scholarships, children of disabled veterans who need educational support." David nodded, still amazed at how quickly the center had come together. The lawsuit settlement from Morrison's estate had provided over $2 million, enough to fund scholarships, counseling services, and emergency assistance for veteran families throughout Tennessee. Through the window, David could see the construction crew putting finishing touches on the memorial garden. At its center stood a bronze statue of a soldier kneeling beside a child, a representation of Samuel Hayes' belief that protecting the vulnerable was every veteran's continuing duty. Detective Rodriguez entered the hall with the official-looking envelope. The FBI finished their investigation into the broader conspiracy. Turns out Morrison and Buchanan weren't the only ones skimming veteran benefits. They've opened cases in 4 other states. How many families were affected? Preliminary count is over 300. Your father's murder was just the tip of the iceberg. David felt a familiar mix of sadness and satisfaction. Samuel Hayes' death was finally serving its intended purpose, protecting other veterans from corruption and neglect. Tommy looked up from his homework, grinning at David with paint-stained fingers. "Mr. David, I finished the multiplication problems, and I'm helping Ms. Jennifer paint the mural tomorrow. Want to help?" "Wouldn't miss it," David replied, ruffling the boy's hair. That evening, David drove to the cemetery one final time before moving permanently back to his hometown. He'd accepted a position as the county's new public works supervisor, overseeing government contracts to prevent future corruption. At Samuel's grave, David placed a simple folder containing newspaper clippings about the center's opening, Morrison's conviction, and the federal investigation his father's murder had triggered. "I kept my promise, Dad," David said quietly. "I found the truth, and I made sure it mattered." The wind rustled through the oak trees as David reflected on the journey that had brought him here. 35 years of pain had been transformed into purpose. His father's murder had become a catalyst for justice, protecting hundreds of veteran families from the corruption that had killed Samuel Hayes. As David prepared to leave, he noticed Tommy approaching with a small American flag, which the boy planted carefully beside the headstone. "I thought your daddy should have his own flag," Tommy said simply. Walking back toward town under the Tennessee stars, David felt the weight of generations connecting: his father's sacrifice, his own pursuit of justice, and Tommy's future filled with possibilities that loving protection could provide. Samuel Hayes had finally come home, and his legacy would live on in every child helped, every veteran protected, and every truth courageously spoken. The circle was complete.